Okay, today I'm interviewing the wonderful Sonja Blignaut. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Tony.
Excellent. And you'll notice that I was very careful about how I said Sonja's name because I was practicing. And so that's why I was very deliberate about how I say it. I want to get it right. Might be really lovely for you to introduce yourself, Sonja, and let people know who you are.
Sure, yes, I am Sonja, as you've just heard, based in Pretoria in South Africa, if my accent hasn't given me away already. Yeah, and I've been working in the field of complexity now for about 2 decades, in and amongst other interesting things like being a professional photographer and originally studied meteorology, so I've got a bit of a science bent. So yeah, that's me.
And the reason we've got you on today is, with all the remote things, we try to talk to people from all sorts of different fields, right? And let's face it, given the upheavals that we've had in the last few years, right? A lot of people are feeling, particularly now that we've moved into the remote frame, and I'm playing some of your own words back here, but I think you talked about it, we're feeling unmoored and feeling lost. And one of the things that you've been really working on is what we call a wayfinder or ways finder. And I thought, it'd be really interesting to bring that to our audience. So it might be interesting for you to sort of talk a little bit about it. I'll preface this with the group that this could take us many hours if we wanted to. So we're only going to get a bit of a taste of this today. But let's talk about Wayfinder or the plural of Ways Finder and why you call it that.
Yeah, so I added the S because I'm very aware that when we are exploring in complexity, and I think it's Anne Pendleton Julian that talks about the white water world, that there's never only one way to find, so that's why I made it plural. And linking a bit to where you started with this idea of feeling unmoored, I've become very aware of the importance of boundaries in human systems. So even if we take it away from the wayfinding idea for a while, for those of you who've got children, if there's no boundaries, children feel a bit unsafe. It's not easy for them to explore when there's no boundaries. And I think adults are the same. And I've been working with Dave Snowden for many years, and he started, bringing in some of the constraints language into Cynefin. And so I got really curious about, how can you practically apply all of these, different ways of thinking about constraints, because, there were others as well. There's Alicia Guerrero. There are, different constraint typologies. And over time, I came up with what I'm calling the Ways Finder. So it's a framework. I'm never quite happy with it, so I have published a version of it. But essentially what it is it's a combination of different kinds of constraints. And the purpose of it is to create a safe to fail, explore space. So it's one of the things that I got really interested in, for example, is how do you distribute decision making? How do you distribute authority? And how do you make it safe for people to explore? And so, I won't go into too much detail, but there are sort of three main constraints involved. The first is having a sense of direction versus a particular goal. And then there are two, kinds of, functional limits almost. And you'll see I'm doing this with my hands all the time, kind of making. So some of my clients call it Sonja's pizza slice because it creates this kind of a cone shape. But, they are constraints, I think in Dave's language, it would almost be governing constraints. I call them functional limits. Constraints we can do nothing about. We just need to work within them. So these could be laws. They could be all kinds of governing things. And then there are other kinds of constraints, more enabling constraints that we can choose. And these are typically things that define our identity. It's who do we choose not to be? That creates another boundary. And so between the sense of direction and where we can't go and where we choose not to go, there's a coherent space that is created that as long as people are within that space, we can allow for diversity, we can allow for distributed decision making, and people can feel safe to explore. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, I want to pick you up a little bit more deep on something you just said there, because it was something that piqued my interest, because obviously I do my homework, and I have been a fan of your work anyway. So, but it's the distributed decision making and the authority, or the bounded authority. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how Wayfinder helps you, or Waysfinder, I'll get it right, Waysfinder helps you with that? Because that's something when we move into this remote frame, or that we have over the last 2 years. Not that it hasn't been happening previous to that, but obviously it's the tidal wave of it. That's become something that's really hard for people, leaders. I know it's very easy to poke points at leadership, but leadership have taken this hard as well, because there's a change in leadership style here that's necessary when you don't have your people right there where you can talk to them all the time. So I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I've got answers, Tony. I think I've got ideas, and as you would know, different things work in different contexts. But what I've seen in many of my own clients, part of what gets in the way of distributing decision making and distributing authority are things like trust, psychological safety. Jennifer Garvey Berger, she's got a wonderful book on the 5 leadership mind traps. I'm not sure if you've read that, but one of them is control. And I think very often we think it's easy to distribute decision making and to distribute authority, but if you are not sure that you can trust your people, it's again, it's almost similar to when you've got children. If you're not sure that you can leave them alone, you need to create like a contained space for them. And so this idea of containment comes in again. So to my mind, if people are aware of where the boundaries are, so where are the kind of decisions that actually we need somebody in a higher authority to make? And where are the decisions that we can safely make? And where are the decisions that we can safely delegate? And bringing some of Cynefin back in, some of what I'm seeing, and I'm not sure how familiar your audience is with Cynefin, but it's a sense-making framework that helps us see where are we dealing with things that's simple and obvious and clear. Where are they complicated, so we need experts, and where are they complex? I see so many decision makers, senior decision makers, who are still making decisions that sits in that clear or obvious domain that can very easily be delegated.
Yeah.
But they kind of get sucked back into that. And so I think if the boundaries are clear, then leaders or senior decision makers can feel more safe to delegate. But then the other side of that coin is, if the boundaries are clear, then the people that are being delegated to can actually feel safe to make those decisions, because that's the other side of this. If I'm not sure where the boundaries are, I'd much rather play safe and just go, delegate up again. So I think that's what the primary way that I feel creating this clearly defined safe space can help with distributing decision making.
I absolutely love that, because it's one of, and if you hear me talk often, I talk about that all the time. It's that bounded autonomy. It plays into that intent-based leadership from David Marquet. Esther Derby talks about it as well. So it's really that enabling of that bounded autonomy, and those really clear guide rails. They come even more important when we move into remote, right? But I think the thing that most people don't get is learned helplessness. And that's because that's what it creates in that. So you create that space, but if you don't create it properly, then you're creating a space for learned helplessness rather than that empowered autonomy, right?
Yeah, and I think something that we lack in many organizations, and it's actually interesting because sometimes our organizations are so filled with targets and KPIs and all of these things, but to some extent there's still we don't have enough consequences. It's really interesting because we just allow people to just essentially go over the boundaries we do set. I'm always I look at leaders, you're familiar with agile, obviously, and very often in organizations where people don't feel safe, they won't directly challenge somebody in authority. They will challenge the boundaries that they set. So when you think of something like time boundaries on a stand-up, for example, people will just, they come late, they'll go over, and that is indirectly a challenge of authority. And we just very often just let it go. We don't, and when you let one go, then suddenly none of your boundaries really mean all that much, So I think there's also, sometimes we need to also not be afraid of making sure that there are consequences when things like learned helplessness take place.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the big things to challenge in organizations, so you do this, and then what I love about your framework is it helps you challenge this, is that what we see is it's that's the way we always do it, right? A great friend of mine calls it thwatty, the dark lord of thwatty. Call out to you, Sharon Robson, right? And organizations have it all through them. It's the way we always did it, and it applies to leadership in the same way, right? So I think it's a fantastic way of doing that. I know you're doing other stuff, so I'll talk a little bit about that because I don't want to. We could talk for hours, but I know you're also doing a thing called complexity fitness, and I'm interested to learn about that, and I'm sure others are. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so complexity fitness is, I think it's a term I first heard from the guys at Cultivating Leadership, Jennifer Garvey Berger's group, and I just immediately loved the idea of becoming fit for complexity. And in this year, actually, a friend of mine, Casper Olofsson, he works also in the field of complexity, but more bringing together complexity and mindfulness. We got together and we just really feel that the time is right now for more people in the world, more decision makers, people across, all walks of life, actually, to become more familiar with what complexity is and what the impact is on them and what the implications are. And we've tried to make this really, really accessible. And so we've been working with a local business school to create a curriculum around it. But essentially, it brings together everything that I've learned over the years about complexity with mindfulness, as well as, things like somatic, all kinds of things like polyvagal theory. We're starting to look into that because, very often you can have a conceptual understanding of complexity, but then, your nervous system responses and, just the stress that very often comes when you start feeling so completely overwhelmed gets in the way. And then all kinds of other things that like curiosity and imagination, and we even go a little bit into well-being, because we very strongly feel if you're not looking after yourself, and coming back to boundaries, if you're not able to set healthy boundaries to make space for things like mindfulness practice or exercise or sleep, you are not going to be able to function very well in complexity. So this is a bit of a passion project. And we, Casper is very good at coming up with some really catchy things. So I know some of the theorists will probably roll their eyes, but we've got this notion of being cool in complexity. And that is a set of 4 meta skills: courage, openness, being being mindful or observant, and lightheartedness or lightness. And so we've been having a lot of fun, creating content around this, and we've been trying to live into it as well. I can be very serious, so I've been really focusing on bringing some more lightness. But that's complexity fitness in a bit of a nutshell.
Yeah, what I really like about that is that piece about looking after yourself. So, one of the things we've seen, we've been on this journey now over 2 years and worked in many of these environments, but it's even more poignant now than ever, is you're so accessible in the remote world and people have been burning themselves out. That's fact, right? We know that. It's not just leadership, it's people in general, because they feel they've got to be on screen or whatever. And it's any tools or any methods that we can use or help people to understand that, you don't need to be doing that. You need to create some space. And if you don't have that mindfulness, and if you don't have that, that look after yourself, then ultimately you're not going to be good to the organization, you're not going to be good for yourself, let alone your family, right?
That's so true, Tony. And I think, what I love about complexity, just as a field, is it gives us very, kind of scientific reasoning for why we need to do particular things. Like another example would be embracing diversity. You can have a very almost a soft humanistic way of thinking about well-being and diversity and all of these things, or it can be more of a compliance kind of an approach. But when you look at it through the lens of complexity, then all of a sudden you start realizing, diversity is a strategic asset we need to manage. Without it, we have no resilience. And it's the same with well-being and looking after yourself and setting boundaries. When you really understand complexity, it kind of gives you a different perspective on many of these things.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant, and there's so much you can wind around it, and I love the diversity piece as well. That's something that a lot of organisations don't tackle well, or they tackle it from the point of compliance, right? As you said. So I think it's another good way to look at that. There's something else that you have a concept that really struck a note with me. I've heard you talk about it. I read a little bit about it, and it's called continuous flux. How we're in this continuous flux. So I thought that would be a really nice piece to bring into this, given what we've just talked about. Want to talk a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, I'm in some circles known as the queen of rabbit trails, because I'm just curious about too many things. So this idea, I think it started, it's an interest that's come quite a long way. So I always get myself in trouble when I'm speaking to change practitioners, because I think change management is an oxymoron in most cases. And change is just continuous, So this idea of continuous flux has kind of been there for a while. And then I came across a book called Everything Flows. It's by a guy called, I can't remember his first name, but his second name is Nicholson. And it's about shifting the, it's a biology book. And it's about essentially shifting from looking at organisms as things to looking at organisms as processes. And obviously human beings are organisms, and we form ecosystems that are, and I just got it was just so interesting, this idea of how we see ourselves to a large extent as objects. We look at animals, we privilege the mature animal, like the mature frog, because that's where it looks the most like a frog. But, it's kind of always in the process of being a frog and of changing.
Yeah.
And so this idea of shifting from thinking in terms of categories and static objects, and thinking of ourselves almost sometimes as being quite static, and our organizations as being stable. And I think we're aware of change, but we think that we can almost opt into when do we want to change and when don't we. Whereas, I think it's Heraclitus that said, no man can step into the same river twice, because it's not the same river and it's not the same man. And so this idea of, and I think it links a bit to complexity fitness, is how do we become change fit? Because we are in a world that's continuously changing. There are some eddies. There are things that's kind of remaining the same. But in general, we are in process. We are in formation. And so how do we make peace with, things being temporary? How do we make it easier to just let go, even of things like what we think we know? So it's an area I'm very actively exploring. It's not always comfortable, but I think it's really useful, especially when we think about all of the change that is coming, everything that humanity is going to have to face in the next few years.
Yeah, I think that the interplay of that between the word VUCA, right? And I think everybody had heard VUCA, all that volatility, uncertainty, right? Everybody had heard that, and they acknowledged it, but it's actually come home in a big way in the last 18 months, right? And it's those methods that help cope with that, because the VUCA is only ramping, as you said, right? And it's only going to continually, given what we've been through, what we're about, and the way technology is evolving. And even the way our organizations are evolving to adapt to what we've been through is going to change everything, right? So we look at it in terms of, from us, obviously remote AF, we're looking at it from the point of view that, what once was few people doing it, or you had that terrible word offshore or distributed teams or whatever it be. Now it's the next normal. It truly is. and I can only see that spanning. So how do you deal with that in terms of I love that change fitness. That's a really good concept, because the more of these kind of frameworks we can have to help people. We have to figure out another word that's not framework, by the way. But
Careful.
I think everybody's having that problem. But the reality is those methods are way. So look, we could talk about that I could talk to you for about hours, but we're really pretty close to the end of our time here. So what I do want to do is give an opportunity, given the things that you've talked about, how can people get involved? How can they touch base with you? How can they get complexity fit and get involved in the Ways Finder?
So some of the options they can. So I blog on Medium, so they can find me just under Sonja Blignaut or Blignaut. I'll be French today on Medium. Or on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I'm kind of everywhere at Sonja BL on Twitter. And then we are currently finalizing there will be two options to participate in complexity fitness. So the one will be through the business school. That will be a much more structured curriculum. And then that will launch in March. And we are starting to do pre-registrations now for a completely online self-paced version that we're also launching early in 2022. So if anybody is interested, they can just get in touch on any of those channels. And yeah, it would be great to have you.
That is brilliant. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Sonja, because I can tell you, so approachable. I just want to thank you for spending the time with me here today and with the viewers. So that is fantastic. Absolutely wonderful to have you on all the remote things.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for inviting me. It's been fun.
Pleasure.